Modern Horizons 3 and Assassin's Creed are now distant memories as we enter Magic the Gathering's cutest set ever, Bloomburrow. There are actually a lot of cards I think are going to be interesting in the context of Modern. I've got a PowerPoint here talking about all of them. Let's get into it. Kitsa, Otterball Elite, is my pick for the best card out of Bloomburrow. There is a lot going on with this card. It is a 2 mana, 1/3 Vigilance Prowess. The Vigilance means you can attack and block with it while also using one of its tap abilities during the same turn cycle. So you can either tap it to draw a card, discard a card, which is really nice. Ability to like, manage Mana Flood, Mana Screw, discard Flage for value if you're playing Flage in your deck is super good. And you also have a very powerful ability to spend 2 mana, tap it, and copy an instant or sorcery spell you control. And you can choose new targets for that copy as well. You can only do this if Kitsa's power is 3 or greater, but it's not too tough to play like Ambitious Bauble, Mox Amber, Lightning Bolt in like the mid to late game to be able to use this for like a real source of card advantage and pressure. Kitsa also has like 2 really nice upsides that are maybe kind of invisible on this card. It's a wizard, and so because it's a good 2 mana wizard in Modern is worth a lot. The ability to play like Kitsa or Tamio on turn 1 or turn 2, and then just on turn 3 2 modes Flame of Anor is really, really nice. And the ability to sometimes copy a 2 mode Flame of Anor is going to be super backbreaking in a lot of matchups. It is going to be very difficult for most decks to beat. You might even be able to do this as soon as turn 4 if you were going to play a deck that was playing Kitsa and Mox Amber, which is something I think you're going to do pretty often. So I've been playing a lot of Basim Ibn Ishaq, and I think this card is great. We top 8 at the challenge with it. I think you're going to see a lot of this card in Modern in the future. And Basim is a card that's also just going to keep getting better and better because like you just have this package of like good cheap blue and black legends where you have Basim, you have Tamio, you have Imri, you could play Satoriel. There's a lot of these like good cheap blue legends, and now you have Kitsa, which is very, 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 very good. And so you get to play a lot of cheap cards to turn your Mox Ambers into like more consistent real Moxin. Mox Amber also is like really good with Kitsa because it's like it gets the power to 2 and then gives you the extra mana to like copy or spell. Like there's a lot of synergy there. And the fact that it's a legend itself for Mox Amber and like card draw off Basim it just matters a lot. Every time you see a new good cheap blue or black legend, you need to like kind of think about Basim a little bit because it really wants you to have a lot of these cards in your deck. And this card just has so much going on. And what's exciting about Kitsa is you could play it in Jeskai Controlling Shells, Blue Red Wizards. You could play it in like Grixis or Grixis Wizards or just Dimir Legends and the Basim Shells. I don't think that this is a card you want to play in just like traditional prowess, but you could maybe build a somewhat non-traditional build of prowess. There are also like some other new prowess cards we'll talk about too, but it's a 2-drop. It's got a lot going on that's like not only just generically powerful but like uniquely good in Modern. A card that I am very excited to play with. It might look kind of innocuous, but I think Thundertrap Trainer is going to be a pretty big deal for Modern. And that's mostly because Modern has been missing like one good cheap blue creature with a powerful ETB effect that is good to sack the Flare of Denial and can also dig for Flare of Denial pretty hard. Flare of Denial is a 0 mana counterspell, and those are pretty dang good. So Thundertrap Trainer is like a much better version than a lot of these cards too. So let's compare Thundertrap Trainer, which might get the nickname Otter of Bolas because it is very similar to Augur of Bolas. Augur of Bolas is a 2 mana 1/3 that looks at the top 3 cards of your library and puts an instant or sorcery into your hand. Thundertrap Trainer is a 2 mana 1/2 that looks at the top 4 cards instead of 3, which is a pretty big deal, and can see any non-creature spell instead of just instants or sorceries. So this means you can put the One Ring into your hand, Teferi Time Raveler into your hand, Mishra's Bubble into your hand. A lot of like really relevant stuff. It also has the ability to like in the late game, if you top deck it, be like a really powerful 2-for-1 that is like going to put you pretty ahead if you're both like in top deck mode because you just get to offspring it and put 2 bodies into play and get 2 cards, which is a really big deal. The card is also a wizard for Flame of Anor. It gets flickered really well by cards like Ephemerate and Felia, and I think this card is just going to be pretty good. I think that I have tried to build several times Flare of Denial control shells, and I think it's like somewhat doable right now. It hasn't really been something that like I think has been like good enough to stream with, but now and now with Trainer, I think we're gonna be there. I think we're gonna be there to have a more flicker focused Flare of Denial control shell be somewhat viable, and I am very excited. Thank you, Thundertrap Trainer. And we have yet another interesting 2-mana blue wizard. Dour Port Mage, a 2-mana 1/3 frog wizard. Whenever one or more creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card. So every time you flicker something, every time you bounce something with either Dour Port Mage's ability to bounce something to your hand, or maybe something like Essence Reliquary, you get to draw a card. There are a lot of good ways to do this in the format with Ephemerate, Felia, Essence Reliquary, Soul Herder, Teferi Time Raveler. Kind of an interesting, easy way to trigger. There's some cool stuff you can do with like the more bounce focused plan, like bounce like Tax Collector to your hand, draw a card, replay it every turn, make your opponent's spells cost one more mana. You could like evoke a Solitude, bounce it to your hand. Although it is very good that this card does not trigger on dying, so you can't just go Port Mage, Grief, Solitude, Subtlety, and just draw a million cards. Have this be the new Up the Beanstalk. Very important. Like this without dying is kind of casually saving the modern format. These two words. But this card is very interesting. I think that I'm kind of excited to build like a blue-white flicker control deck that's kind of like focused on Thundertrap Trainer, Dour Port Mage, Felia, and then just kind of playing a lot of instants and sorceries beyond that. And then you could also be more of like an Aether Vial deck with Dour Port Mage, which I think is going to be kind of interesting too. So very cool card, very fun card advantage engine. Excited to try it out. Okay, do you remember how I just said that Dour Port Mage, it's good that it has this without dying clause. You can't just like play it then evoke a bunch of elementals. Well, we also have Helga Skidashir, who is good with Solitude and Subtlety specifically. This is a Bant 3-mana 1/3. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4 or greater, you draw a card. You gain 1 life, and you put a counter on Helga. So, kind of like Up the Beanstalk, you can play this card, and then you can evoke your Solitudes, evoke your Subtleties, draw cards, and kind of like grow this as a value engine. Unlike Up the Beanstalk, this card doesn't cantrip when it enters. Unlike Up the Beanstalk, it's 3 mana instead of 2, which is a huge deal. And also, unlike Up the Beanstalk, you can't just like cascade into it super easily. That being said, this card does pitch to Endurance, Subtlety, Solitude, which is a pretty big deal. It's actually super good. I think the life gain on this card is like kind of innocuous, but if you're gonna like the card advantage engines that also gain life are kind of rare and really powerful when they're good. This card also has the ability to add X mana of any one color, where X is Helga's power, and you can only use this to cast creature spells with mana value 4 or greater, or creatures with mana value X and their mana cost. So I actually love that this card can't make like 4 different colors of mana to just cast an Omnath. I like that it can only tap for 1 mana for an Omnath. I guess I don't like that for like the competitive playability of this card, but I think as for like constructed gameplay, I think that's probably pretty good. And I don't necessarily think like the 4-color value piles in general are super good, but I think that this Helga card could be like a good reason to just get to play the full 8 pitch cards, which would probably make the decks a bit better to be just like a little less fair and a little more powerful. Mockingbird is another cheap, good blue creature. There's a lot of these, as you can maybe tell in the set, and I really like Mockingbird. The more I'm thinking about it, the more I think this card is going to be like just probably really good, or like a really good direction to go in some of the energy decks. So this is a blue X 1/1 flyer, so it can just be a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, which isn't very good, but sometimes you'll do it if you have Flare of Denial. But you can have this enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, your side or opponent's side. You can have it enter as a copy if you spend the same amount of mana as that creature's mana value. So if you want to copy a Guide of Souls or Ocelot Pride, you just spend the 1 blue mana. You don't have to go, it's not like a Green Sun Zenith where you have to spend blue X and X is the mana value. The blue counts towards the mana value, which is a huge deal. And the fact that this like if you copy Guide of Souls, it's incredible. If you copy Ocelot Pride, the Ocelot Pride has flying and can fly over creatures. Like that's also incredible. And the fact that these like energy decks are just so focused around these 2 cards, and they're like just both really good to copy. And Ranger Captain is also a really good tool of this deck. It just all comes together so well. You have like these really interesting like card advantage loop possibilities with Ranger Captain Mockingbird. We just go Ranger Captain, get a Mockingbird, spend 3 mana to copy Ranger Captain, get another Mockingbird. You can just keep doing that, and just like with 1 Ranger Captain, you can have 4 copies of Ranger Captain in play and then eventually like also maybe lost up Pride or Guide of Souls. You can just kind of pop off with just 1 copy of this card. I've also been like wanting to play blue-white energy recently. where I think the energy that like the white threats, right? Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride are I think better than Ragavan DRC. And so like if that's the case, why is like our tempo deck blue red Murktide instead of blue white Murktide? So I've been wanting to do that recently. I'll probably be doing that on stream later this week. And I think that if that list ends up being good, Mockingbird will just fit so well into the archetype. I think that this card is really cool, really interesting with this package of cards. And like when I was first thinking about Mockingbird, I'm like, oh yeah, maybe one of two to target with Ranger Captain. But it's like this card is just gonna be really good to draw like a huge chunk of the time. You're just gonna be like the MH3, like you copy Ajani for 2 mana, flip Ajani. It just like the MH3 cheap creatures are so good, and they're so good to copy. You could copy an Amped Raptor too. It's like this card's gonna be good. I think I'm excited for it. Okay, we've got our first non-blue card in the list, also a creature, Iridescent Vinelasher. 1 mana, 1/2, landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. And you can copy this. So you can have a 1/1 token copy of this for 3 mana, and then you can go like 3 mana, 2 of these, fetch land, deal your opponent 4. And kind of simply put, this is a very good aggressive black creature in a format with fetch lands. This is going to be pretty regularly dealing your opponent like 2 to 3 damage a turn. More if you offspring it. And you know, this is kind of something we've seen with Ocelot Pride. 1 mana creatures that are good on turn 1 and also good later are super duper nice. Like Ragavan has this really big problem of like being a creature that you top deck and you're like, oh, this is the worst spell I could have possibly drawn. But Ocelot Pride is like, oh, this is going to make 3 tokens every single turn for the rest of the game. And Vinelasher is kind of like that, where you like top deck it and you just get to make 2 copies and then all of a sudden, oh, you have to kill these or they're gonna kill you pretty quick. There's some like other interesting stuff where this like commits crimes for cards like Magda and Free Strider Lookout. And I do think one problem this card has is there aren't too many like black based like aggro decks, and so like I don't know exactly where you're putting this card. I don't think you want to play it in like the Phyrexian Tower Nightmare Shells. I don't think you necessarily want to play it in like Rakdos Scam. But the card is pretty good, and it could end up just making the cut of these shells. And you also have Nethergoyf as like another cheap, good, aggressive black 1-drop. So like maybe this kind of shell, just a more aggro black-based deck, can emerge because of Vinelasher. I like this card. I am excited to cast it. Okay, our first white card and our first non-creature card we're talking about is Parting Gust. I think this card is really cool, and I don't exactly think it'll be a big player of Modern or will necessarily be playable, but it is very interesting to me, and it's also very flexible, which is what I like about this card, is how flexible it is. And as a small aside, I think flexibility on your Modern cards is not as important as it used to be. You mostly just want to have cards that have like high raw power level rather than cards that are very versatile. But this one just might be powerful enough to like compensate for that, in addition to being very flexible. So let's read the card. 2 mana, white instant. Exile target non-token creature. And if you didn't promise your opponent a 1/1 blue fish token that's tapped as a gift, the creature comes back with a +1 counter at the beginning of the next end step. So it is a otherworldly journey if you want. Exile any creature, your creature or your opponent's creature, and you get to flicker it and put a counter on it. Or if you gift them, you can. It's basically a crib swap. You get to exile your opponent's creature and give them a 1/1. Although it's 1 less mana than crib swap, and it gives them a tapped creature instead of an untapped creature, which is a pretty big deal. And so the fact that this is one kind of a pretty good removal spell. I don't usually like Beast Within Pognify type effects because like you're just kind of 2-for-1ing yourself. But a tapped 1/1 is pretty bad. A tapped 1/1 is so much worse than a 3/3. I think that this is actually just a pretty good removal spell. And you're going to play it obviously in a more creature focused deck too, where you just care a lot less about that 1/1 fish. And the fact that it's also a protection spell for your creatures, and it can also be a card that like can reuse ETB effects, it can scam Solitude, is a really big deal. It's also like, I think, quietly very good that this card brings the creature back at the beginning of the next end step, so that if your opponent plays Wrath Disguise, you can protect your creature because it'll just go away and come back on end step and ignore the Wrath Disguise. Compare that to Ephemerate, which doesn't do that. So I think this card's pretty cool. I like it. I think that this card will very, very often, when you want to play it, you're going to play it as like a 1 or a 2 of. It's 2 mana. You don't want to draw them that early necessarily. You don't want to draw them that often. This is like a turn 3, turn 4 play. But maybe Goryo's ends up playing this. It's like it exiles Lothy Voidwalker, which is really nice. It scams your stuff. I like this one. I do hope it's good enough. And then we have another good 2 mana removal spell. Feed the Cycle. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. This can either cost one generic mana, 2 black mana, or you can forage to pay for 1 of the black mana. To forage, you either sacrifice a food, so you can do this in some food specific decks, or you can just exile 3 cards from your graveyard. So I've been kind of thinking like of this as like a better murderous cut, where it's like you always spend 2 mana and you delve 3 to cast it, but it can kill planeswalkers in addition to just creatures, which is a really really big deal, I think, or like a pretty big deal at the very least. Like, when you play your removal spells in Modern, the fact that it like misses Teferi, Rin 6, Karn the Great Creator, Grist is not, it's not like the biggest deal, but like these cards can be like really awkward in matchups. Especially, honestly, not that Grist is super popular at the moment, but there are like several times you'll like just lose to Yawgmoth because you hold up a removal spell and they play Grist instead of a creature. And the fact that this kills this is good. I think this card's pretty solid. Um, Maybe I should say this is that like I've been of the opinion for years that like Murderous Cut is like pretty underplayed, and like when I play like Dimir, Golgari, Rakdos, I'll pretty often play like one Murderous Cut main, one Murderous Cut side, one Murderous Cut side, something like that. It's like a pretty good one of removal spell that I think has been very underplayed for a long time and is, I think, still pretty underplayed. And I think Feed the Cycle is like a slightly better version of it. So not a card you're going to see as a 4 of in most decks, I would think, but it is like, I think, a better version of a card that is underplayed. Mistbreath Elder is a really interesting card, and I want to talk about it. It's a 1 mana 2/2. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, you put a counter on Mistbreath Elder. Otherwise, you may return Mistbreath Elder to its owner's hand. So, if this is the only creature in play, you don't have to bounce it. But if you have another creature in play, you do have to bounce them. And kind of simply put, this card is very interesting to reuse ETB effects. I think this card is specifically very powerful if you go turn 1 Elder, turn 2 Amped Raptor, cast your spell, and then every turn you can just bounce your Amped Raptor, replay it, cast another spell, and keep doing that. I think it's also kind of interesting with Burning Tree Emissary, where this is a card that you can just kind of bounce, reuse the mana, and like not worry about too much. And this card is also pretty interesting with Ranger Captain of Eos, where one, it's a 1 mana creature that can be tutored with Mistbreath Elder, but it also has like a really good ETB effect you can keep using. You can just keep bouncing your Ranger Captain, casting it, getting Guide of Souls, Ocelot Prides, whatever you want. And I don't know. This card is cool. This card is cool. It's got a lot going on. It is the kind of card that is usually not very good, but is like pretty uniquely effective in what it does. And I think there's like a somewhat good chance this card is like not quite good enough now, but might end up being good enough one day if we get like, another card that's like a 2 mana creature with a quality ETB of Amped Raptor, this kind of stuff. So maybe not now, but a pretty interesting card, and maybe one day. Clifftop Lookout is a fun little frog, a 3 mana 1/2 reach. When it enters the battlefield, reveal cards from the top of your library. Until you reveal a land card, you put that card into play tapped and the rest on the bottom. This card is kind of the best version of this effect we've seen. It's a 1/2 reach instead of a 1/1, which is honestly pretty relevant. Chump Block Murktide doesn't just get pinged by Bowmaster, and you can't brick on this card. You are always going to hit a land when you cast this, as opposed to Rejuvenator card you're going to brick on. Now, obviously, Elvish Rejuvenator is like not a particularly playable card, but it is like, when you get a card that is maybe kind of borderline like this and you get one that's much better, it's worth looking at. It's also kind of notable you could sack this to Flare of Cultivation, but I think even in this kind of shell, you're probably not really that excited to play Clifftop Lookout in your deck. It is a little weak, but I think the main thing that's interesting about this card is that you can build your deck that's all MDFCs, cards like Turn Timber Symbiosis, Aghanim's Awakening, lands that are not lands on the front side. So you could have a deck that's all of those, and then 4 Lotus Fields. So every time you cast Clifftop Lookout, you put a Lotus Field into play. Lotus Field is a very powerful card. You can combo off with it by untapping it pretty pretty easily, and the fact that this just puts it into play every single time, I think is kind of interesting. Is this going to be like the way that you build these decks? Maybe not, but I do think you could try to. Sunspine Lynx is a card I'm liking a little bit more now than when I was first reading it. It's a pretty interesting 4 mana elemental cat, 4 mana 5/4. Players cannot gain life. Damage cannot be prevented. When it enters, it deals damage to each player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So just if you're confused about how the ruling works here, if the ring is played and your opponent has protection from everything, what that protection is doing is it means that your opponents can't target you. Sunspine Lynx doesn't target, each player takes the damage, and protection effectively prevents the damage. And so because Link says damage can't be prevented, you're going to take the damage from the ETB trigger even if you have that protection. And so this card, like the ability for your opponent to like cast the ring, feel somewhat safe, and then you play Lynx, they're going to take a good amount of damage, 2 to 5, something like that, and then be able to be attacked by any other creatures you have in play. I think we may see a situation where your opponents are slamming this and pressuring your opponent. To win the game through the ring. I think this is going to be the most likely a tool you want to play in Rhinos specifically. I remember when I was testing with the CFB team, we had some questing beasts in our lists, our Rhinos list to pressure ring decks, and I remember Kai top aided with questing beast in his 75, and this is I think a better version of that. Stopping any amount of life gain is also pretty relevant, and it's nice that if your opponent does have a removal spell up for the Lynx, then you'll still be able to get that damage through. Not if there's the ring in play, but it just like in general, I think it like having like your haste on the card be in the form of an ETB effect is a lot better. So you get that damage in even if it dies. So I like this card. It's going to be like very fringe. This kind of effects, the kind of deck that can play this, but those that can, I think, will be pretty interested in using this as an option to beat ring decks. So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Kitsa that there were some other interesting prowess cards from the set. And I think all of these cards are really cool and uniquely powerful and do something special. And I don't know if any of them are going to be like better than existing options, but I actually think they're all worth trying. So first we have Emberheart Challenger. It's a 2-mana 2/2 haste prowess. Haste prowess is a pretty good line of text, and has this ability called Valiant that says whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, you get to like have a half light at the stage. You get to exile the top card of your library and play it till the end of the turn. So when you target this for the first time on a turn with mutagenic growth or flashed back lava dart, or maybe you even just want to like use gut shot, just gut shot your challenger, trigger prowess on all your stuff, and kind of like cycle your gut shot. One of these effects seems pretty interesting. It is. I don't think we've ever really had like a 2-mana prowess threat that can just kind of draw you a card every turn, or maybe it draws you a card with mutagenic growth, but maybe it'd be better to say that it like cycles like flashback lava dart and stuff, or front half of lava dart, which I think it's interesting. Of course, like we just had Slick Shot Show Off, which is probably better than this card, but I think one thing that could be interesting about rebuilding prowess or rethinking prowess is maybe you're doing something like you're playing, 3 show-offs, 2 challengers. You don't like these cards are like situationally better than others in some spots, and so maybe like trying to build a list with splits is kind of interesting. Storm Chaser's Talent is also super unique for a prowess card too. Is this card better than Soulscar Mage? Maybe. Is it better than Swift Spear? Probably not. It is a 1-mana blue enchantment. When it enters, you get a 1/1 prowess otter token. And so this is the main part of this card, but it is nice that this card has some additional upsides. But what's mostly cool about this is that this is a prowess creature that triggers prowess itself. So if you're casting this as an enchantment, you're getting a 1-mana prowess creature that's worse than Soulscar Mage. It's weaker, but it triggers prowess on all of your other stuff, which is pretty interesting. It also is an enchantment. If you play, Channeler or other Delirium cards in your deck, it helps with that. It is also like a late game mana sink. So for 4 mana, you can return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to hand. For 6 mana, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you make an otter token of prowess. And so to some extent, it's kind of nice that like just one of these has a really good chance to just outgrind opponents in the late game. That isn't exactly something that prowess has a huge trouble with. You do have like a lot of card advantage. You have Underworld Breach. So I don't know if you like really need this that much, but it's cool. I don't know, like it could be the case that you like want to play like one copy of this card too. And I think it's very interesting that it's a 1-mana prowess creature that triggers prowess. Stormcatch Mentor, another like uniquely powerful prowess card that does a very different thing. I think it's awesome that we have four like pretty cool, interesting, playable prowess creatures, and they're all like unique and they're very like they're very special. I think they did a good job with these four cards. But this one is a 2-mana 1/1 haste prowess, so haste prowess again, but 1/1 instead of 2/2, which is a big downside. But it says instants and sorceries cost one less to cast. This is it's like a goblin electromancer with haste and prowess. It's kind of wild. It's also a wizard for Flame of Anor, so Flame of Anor costing one less is kind of interesting. You could play this in like a bigger prowess list. I basically always like to have Manamorphose in my prowess lists, and in the past I've played some kind of like hybrid storm prowess list that I've done kind of well with, where I've played Goblin and Narcomancer as this way to like backdoor into like the storm style combo. And Stormcatch Mentor is like seems so much better than that because it just itself is like a hasty prowess threat that like if you untap with it and you have like DRCs, breaches, Manamorphose, you can just loop through your entire deck or nearly your entire deck, enough to kill your opponent at the very least. So three very very cool cards. Cards I could see all of these being good and playable in modern. I could see none of them being good and playable in modern because like to some extent it's like I think all these cards are good enough, but when we're talking about cards actually making an impact to modern, they have to be optimal for the deck list. There are a lot of cards that are like powerful enough to see play, but there are better options. Powerful enough to see play, and there are better options. And I think that it's going to take some testing and some time and some rethinking of prowess lists to like figure out where these cards lie. And I'm excited to try to figure it out. We also have an interesting cycle of lands here. I don't want to spend too much time on them because we've kind of reached this point in modern where there's a ton of good utility lands. And they're all like a lot of them are kind of fringe, and you just kind of end up in places where you might play some of them. But I want to say like the main purpose of Lilypad Village, Mudflash Village, all these villages is that these are lands that enter untapped and can tap for colorless and can tap for a color. So just ignoring the rest of this is that these are mana fixers for monocolor Eldrazi lists. So I think that the teamer colors are the most interesting because like mono green, mono blue, mono red Eldrazi are all different directions you can go where black and white are not really things. But the fact that this like fixes for Eldrazi and fixes for your other color and your monocolor Eldrazi decks while possibly occasionally giving you some extra upside is pretty nice. It's also kind of interesting, like the Lilypad Village cares about otters entering the battlefield. Rockface Village also can buff otters and give them haste. And we have gotten some playable otters in the set. But I think this is mostly flavor text, and I mostly think that these could be good, interesting Eldrazi tools, and then occasionally, yes, you'll be playing a deck that is like monocolor and has some bats or wizards or otters or squirrels, and put some copies of this in your deck because these are just pretty good utility lands. Lands that enter untapped, tap for a color, and have an upside. Examples would be like Lair of the Hydra, Beseiju, the old school like legendary like a Gonjo. They like the downside on these is just so low that the incidental upside is like pretty nice. Portent of Calamity is definitely my favorite card in the new set. I love this card. It's really like kind of sparked some creativity. I'm really excited to try to build around this one. It is a sorcery, blue X. Reveal the top X cards of your library. For each card type, you may exile a card from that type among them, and put the rest in your graveyard. You may cast a spell from among those exile cards without paying the mana cost if you exile 4 or more cards this way. So if you exile 4 different cards with 4 different types, you can cast one of those cards for free and put the rest into your hand. That is really powerful if you get to do that, kind of simply put. So, let's like dream big. You top deck this card, you casted X equals 5, X equals 6, you've built your deck with a big diversity of types, and you're able to hit Omniscience and like 3 or 4 different spells, put Omniscience into play, cast a bunch of different stuff, and to win the game. This could be like redundancy to a Shifting Woodland and like an Omniscience deck, which I think is kind of cool. It's also possible you just want to try to ramp into this and like cast an Emrakul or just cast like your best thing and put the rest of the cards into your hand. And so what's interesting to me is like this is obviously the best case scenario for this card. You have 5, 6, 7 mana, you cast it, you win the game. But what I like about this card is it just cycles for 2 mana. cycles for 2 mana. You can maybe draw 2 cards for 3 mana. Draw 3 cards for 4 mana. If you're, or maybe just 2 cards for 4 mana if you don't hit 3 different types, of course. But the floor on this card is not so low. If you draw multiples, you can just cycle it, which I think is pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool. I don't think that this card is going to get there. It's possible you could play this in like a mono blue Tron shell where you're like, I'm going to cycle it early. It's going to win the game late. I would love for this card to get there. I'm going to try really hard. I think it is possible, but I think probably not. Dewdrop Cure is kind of simply put a card that's pretty efficient on rate for what it does. It's a 3 mana sorcery that returns 2 creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can gift a card to your opponent to return 3 things instead of 2 things. So kind of simply put, can return your combo pieces for Amalia, can return your combo pieces for Sam, and I've trophied enough leagues with Amalia. I've trophied enough leagues with Amalia that also has Samwise combo to think that I would probably have some copies of Dewdrop Cure in these lists. Maybe you would want to play this in a different shell too. Again, Ocelot Pride and Guide of Souls are just so good, and like buying back both of those in late game seems kind of nice, but you probably just would play Jolted Awake in those slots instead. So, not sure, but it's pretty effective for what it does on a rate, and you should have it in your deck building toolbox when you build decks like Amalia or Sam combo. So, Husk Burster Swarm is pretty cool. You always want to pay attention to cards that can have their cost reduced. This spell is normally 8 mana, but can have its cost reduced for 1 for each creature you own in exile and in your graveyard. So, and also has Menace and Death Touch, which Menace is more important than Death Touch on this card, but it's pretty nice. So you could do 2 things with this card. You could, 1, play a not very competitive but very fun deck with Serum Powder, where you are trying intentionally to exile a lot of cards before the game begins, using Serum Powder to just exile your hands, hopefully put a lot of creatures in there, and then keep a hand that has Huskbuster, just cast a 1 mana 6 minutes on turn 1. That'll be very fun. We might do it once on stream, but will not likely be competitive at all. You could do that, or you could play this in the sideboard of your Dredge deck, where if your opponents are bringing in a lot of graveyard hate, you just can still cast this as a 1 mana 6/6 Menace Death Touch, and which is really going to be good in sideboard games as the Dredge player, where opponents like are going to mulligan pretty aggressively for graveyard hate and may have a hard time dealing with a 1 mana 6/6 Menace Death Touch. And what's cool about this card is this card also is just going to be very castable if you draw it in your Dredge deck, because it also counts the cards in your graveyard. So nice tool for Dredge, fun Serum Powdered card, pretty interesting overall. I also just noticed that this card is an insect, and cares about creatures in your graveyard, so maybe they want you to like mill over this with Grist and get an extra insect token, but that's probably not really a thing. We also have Cash Grab, amazing card name. This is basically Benevolent Rumble, which is kind of emerging as a modern staple. A ton of brews have been playing 4 of this card and loving it. Both cards mill the top 4 and put a permanent card from among them into your hand. Cash Grab is an instant. Rumble is a sorcery. Cash Grab lets you make a food token if you control a squirrel or if you return a squirrel to your hand. This will probably never happen in Constructed Modern, but I mean, never say never. But the big difference is that Rumble gives you a spawn token, and so effectively Rumble oftentimes plays like it's a 1-drop instead of a 2-drop. Or like just ramps you into a 4 mana spell on turn 3, which is really big and makes it a lot better than Cash Grab is. But Cash Grab is an instant, which definitely does matter. And I think it's also kind of interesting that like Rumble is just like so good, and like playing Cash Grab is like the 5th or 6th Rumble. You're not almost ever going to play four of each in a deck, I think. But I could definitely see myself playing like one of this card in decks. I think it's pretty efficient for what it does. I like that it's an instant. It gives you some redundancy for these like green decks that care about filling up the graveyard. Kind of nice like Rumble number 5 or 6. Festival of Embers is a 5-mana enchantment that basically gives all instants and sorceries in your graveyard flashback, but you have to pay an additional life in addition to their other costs. Kind of simply put, I think this card is like a pretty reasonable wish target in Ruby Storm that allows you to like main deck 4 Past in Flames and then wish for this as like a pseudo Past in Flames when you're comboing off. I think that it's probably a little bit better than Underworld Breach in those decks where the escape 3 cost is kind of tough. It gets there a lot of the time. but it isn't always quite there in my testing with Ruby Storm. And I really want to main deck for Past in Flames, and so this is kind of like worst but fifth Past in Flames that you can wish for. And you have to do like a little bit of testing to see if that's actually the case, or maybe it is a little bit suboptimal, but I think it probably just makes the cut. Okay, so this may become a recurring trend, but I was initially really excited for Innkeeper's Talents. I thought this card was really cool. 2-mana enchantment at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a counter on a creature you control, and then for 1 mana, only 1 mana, all permanents you control with counters have ward 1, including Urza Saga, which is pretty cool. So like, and then every combat you get to give something a counter and ward 1. This is like a pretty interesting tool for Hardened Scales. And then it also becomes a Hardened Scales if you have enough mana in the late game to level up again. I thought this card would be like a really cool like 1 or 2 of in Scales. I was thinking you could replace like some numbers of like the 2-mana Ozolith. I was liking this card a lot. And then I'm just thinking more and more, and I have been really shying away from 1 and 2 mana artifact enchantment based value engines. Urza Saga 2 to some extent. It's just Wrath of the Skies is really popular modern card, really really good modern card, and these like cheap artifact enchantment value engines used to be like pretty good because of how resilient they were. They're just not very resilient anymore, and playing cards like this is just going to set you up for big blowouts when you play against Wrath of the Skies. So it's not that you can't play Innkeeper's Talent as like a 1 or 2 of in Scales still, but I'm just not that excited for the card anymore. I just mostly gonna stay away from a 1 or 2 mana enchantment value engines for forever. I don't know, until Wrath of Skies is less popular at the very least. Paul Patch Formation, I think, is a pretty good sideboard card. 2 mana instant. Destroy target creature with flying. Destroy target enchantment. So, Murktide Regent, Urza Saga, a Jumped, Psychic Frog. A lot of really relevant creatures with flying. Nadu. And it's also nice that this kills Urza Saga out of Nadu decks and can kill Nadu itself. I would board it in against Nadu for as long as Nadu remains legal. And then it's also very cool that you can just cycle this and make a food. This is going to be more relevant in decks that care about making food, which there's not too many decks at the moment, but decks I have historically liked to play. And so it is always really cool when like you bring in a sideboard card. Like this is going to kill your opponent's Urza Saga and like blow you out if you do. But if they don't draw Urza Saga, the fact that you can cycle it and get a little bit of extra value is really kind of like unique and nice on an effect like this. So kind of fringe, but I've registered Run Afoul in Modern, and this card is a pretty nice variation of like a Run Afoul, pick your poison. Eddie Merc Crab is another one of these cards that's like powerful enough to see Modern play, but kind of is just going to get outshined by Murktide Regent specifically. So this is a 7-mana 5/5 flash, costs 1 less for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and it enters tapped if it's not your turn. And when it enters, you can tap up to 2 target creatures. So you can use it as a way to like stop yourself from getting attacked by 2 creatures by flashing it on their turn, or you can play it on your turn untapped and tap 2 blockers. So that's pretty cool. It's not as powerful as Murktide Regent. I do think it's possible you can play a deck with this and Tolarian Terror, which is another 7-mana creature that costs less for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. And if you play both of these, then you're not really wanting to exile cards from your graveyard. You want to keep them in there to cast more of these. And so you wouldn't want to play Murktide Regent in that case, because Murktide wants you to exile your instants and sorceries from the graveyard to have a big dragon. But the thing is, Murktide Regent is a gigantic dragon. It's a 2-mana 8/8 flyer. It's just so much more powerful than Tolarian Terror and the Crab. Those cards are good, and they would probably see some play if it wasn't for Murktide. But Murktide, I think, is probably just going to still reign supreme for this kind of effect. So Keen-Eyed Curator, kind of the inverse of Eddie Merc Crab. Eddie Merc Crab is a worse version of Murktide Regent. I think Curator is like a little bit better than Scavenging Ooze. Not a lot better, but it's a 2-mana 3/3 instead of a 2-mana 2/2. Both cards can exile any card from a graveyard, although this can exile it for a generic mana instead of a green mana, so it can just eat a lot more, not being hindered by the amount of green mana you have. And this becomes a 4/4 a 7/7 with trample when you exile 4 or more different types with this, as opposed to Ooze, which doesn't get trample. Trample is so big on a big creature like this, obviously. But Ooze can also gain life, but only when you exile creature cards. So some differences here. Kind of simply put, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think Curator is a little bit better than Ooze. The trample is a big deal. The generic activating cost is nice. The fact that it dodges Unholy Heat early is nice. Um, but like Scavenging Ooze isn't really a playable modern card. Some Yawgmoth players love their one of Ooze. Personally, I hate. I don't like the Ooze. Um, Maybe if you're a Yawgmoth player who likes Ooze, you can play Curator. But I have here, Curator a little bit better than Ooze, but not as good as actual playable modern cards. So a lot of people like this card, but the Ooze is just its time in the sun is kind of over for the most part. It used to be a big player in constructed Magic, and it's just kind of been power leveled out. Very iconic card people love. This is a cool take on it, but we are kind of past this kind of effect. I don't really have a lot to say about Fountain Port. I acknowledge that it's like a pretty reasonable colorless utility land that can do a lot. Enters untapped, can sacrifice a token, draw a card. That's nice. It can make a creature token for 3 mana and a life. It can make a treasure token. This is all really nice, but 5 or 6 years ago, this would have been pretty exciting. The way it is now, there are just tons and tons of really good colorless utility lands that just see no play, and they just see no play. And I think this is just going to be one of them. Maybe occasionally we'll get to play this, but to me, it's just one of those like this card's really cool, and there just is not room. There just is not room, especially in these like colorless Tron decks. It's like you have 12 Tron lands, you have 4 Eldrazi Temple, you have 4 Labyrinth. This is 20 lands. Then you need to play like 2 basics, maybe 3 basics for like Besage's Field of Ruins and stuff. And then like that, and then you have 4 expedition maps, and like so like you maybe have room for one one colorless utility land. So it just kind of has to be the best one. I don't think this is it, but it is interesting, and we have now talked about it. So Wishing Well is a card that I really like. This is not going to be a competitive modern card, probably just like period. 4 mana artifact, tap, put a coin counter on it. When you do, cast instant or sorcery with mana value equal to the number of coin counters on Wishing Well from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. And then that card gets exiled. You can only do this as a sorcery too, so you can't like get this up to 1 counter, cast a bolt, untap, and then cast a counter spell on your opponent's turn for free. If you could, this card would be a lot more interesting. You can't. And then the big problem with this card also is like you keep putting a counter on this card every single turn, and once it goes up, it can't go back down. And so it's you in theory will be able to cast like a 1, a 2, a 3, and you're done. You're not going to be able to get more off of this, and this is slow and can be worse than the Ring, worse than like Snapcaster Flame of Venor as a card advantage engine, just worse than everything else. But I want to talk about it because like to some extent, Modern is not just all about building competitive decks. Like that is what I like to do, and that's what my channel is about. But it doesn't have to be what you're about. If you want to build like a really cool deck, if you want to build a sick deck, Wishing Well is a great card for that. Wishing Well is an awesome card to build a really cool, unique deck around. And I just want to put it here to encourage you to do that. I probably won't because that's just not really what I'm about, but to a big extent, there is a big section of the modern player base who I think would just love a card like this, and I think this card is for y'all, and I just would like to see somebody embrace it and become, oh, that's the Wishing Well guy. They're like, they always bring Wishing Well to our FNMs, and their deck is really cool, and they like, win more than you'd expect them to, and I don't know. I just get kind of nostalgic for cards like this because it reminds me a lot of like what I was like when I first started playing. Okay, so Three Tree City got spoiled. A lot of people really excited for maybe putting this in Elves. Kind of simply put, I think this card would be bad in Elves and probably has no applications in Modern at all. It is pretty cool. It's a land that can tap for extra mana, potentially. You can spend 2 mana, tap it, choose a color, and add amount of mana of that color equal to the amount of creatures you control of that type. And so it's kind of interesting in Elves, right? You have cards like Elvish Warmaster, Dwynen's Leap that make tokens, and these tokens can be counted for this type, kind of compared to Nykthos, which only counts Devotion, which doesn't count these. But Nykthos is really bad, and this card is not much better. Kind of simply put, in your Elf deck, you have a lot of cheap 1 mana green cards, and you want to be able to go one of these into like 2 of these next turn. And you just really cannot afford to play a colorless land in your deck. You also just got you also like don't really need another mana engine either, or you're not so desperate for another mana engine that you would play this card. Maybe that's a better way to put it. But you have Priest of Titania, you have Heritage Druid, and these are better than this card. And a colorless land is really tough and really kind of bad. And in order for this card to even make, like, to tap for 2 mana effectively, you have to have 4 elves in play. You have to have 4 elves in play for this to be a +1 mana. And if you have 4 elves in play, you're probably going to win anyways, because things can kind of spiral out of control. So, card is, in my opinion, not good enough. Maybe one day there could be some, like, very weird deck that wants to play this card, but it ain't good enough, and is probably never going to be good enough. You know, it's good to talk about, you know, cards like Three Tree City and cards like Jackdaw Savior, because a lot of people are thinking about these cards in the context of Modern. So while, of course, it's important to talk about the cards that I think are playable, I also, of course, always like to talk about cards like this that other people are talking about and are hyped for, and I want to help manage expectations on some stuff, I guess. But like Jackdaw Savior is another one of these. It's a 3-mana 3/1 flyer. Whenever this or another creature you control with flying dies, you return another creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I've seen some people talking about doing some like convoluted loops with this card and like Phantasmal Image and like copying a creature with a higher mana value, then sacking it and looping it. The thing is, these combos just aren't very good. To me, this type of deck seems like it'd be kind of significantly worse than Sophy plus Renegade Rallier plus a sack outlet. This would be like this plus Phantasmal Image plus another card plus a sack outlet. But it's like, this seems worse than Sophy Rallier, and Sophy Rallier isn't good. I've played a lot of it. It is just a tier below where you need to be. And so I've seen some people excited about this card. I don't want to raid on your parade too much. And again, Three Tree City, Jackdaw Savior, Wishing Well. These are the kind of cards that you can build a very cool deck that you can feel some connection and some identity with. But if we're talking about competitive constructed Modern cards, none of these 3 make the cut. So wanted to go over that. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you tuning in. Love making these videos. I'm glad that y'all are still liking them. We'll continue to make them for every set comes out. We'll continue to stream new decks, new brews over on twitch.tv/aspiringspike every day. So thank you for watching. Goodbye. Kitsa Otterball Elite is my pick for the best card out of Bloomburrow. I've had to record this segment several times because Kitsa just has so much going on. I'm trying to get it as concise as possible, and I don't know why I'm saying this, bro.